All right, welcome to the first lecture of week 10. Welcome back from spring break, if you had a spring break. So what we're going to be doing today, right, is building on what we did, well, not last week, but the week before, right, where we introduced categorical propositions, right? So we're going to put them together into what we'll call syllogisms, right? And here's an interesting question about syllogisms, right? Given that they're a type of argument, how do we determine if they're valid or invalid? All right, so let's think about the big idea. So we'll start off with this. Here's an argument: all vertebrates are mammals. All mammals are dogs. Therefore, all dogs are vertebrates. Okay, so this is an argument, right? It turns out it's what we're going to call a syllogism. Here's a question about it: is it valid or invalid? Right, so just by looking at it, I don't expect you to have any sort of like immediate intuition as to its validity or invalidity. But what we're going to work on this week is setting the groundwork for figuring out whether or not these arguments are valid or invalid. So what we're going to do, right, is build these special type of Venn diagrams, right, and use those to determine whether the argument is valid or invalid. So you might remember Venn diagrams from, I don't know, middle school? I'm not sure when these get introduced. I remember learning about them, though. But they're the circles that either intersect or don't, right? And they're shaded in various ways, and that tells us something about like 2 or 3 classes of objects, right? How they're related to one another. So we're going to use those to show whether or not this argument and other arguments like it are valid or invalid. So I said we're going to use Venn diagrams to say whether or not arguments like that are valid or invalid, right? So what do I mean by arguments like that? Well, what I have in mind here are syllogisms, right? And these are special argument forms, and they have 4 features, or at least 4 features are of interest to us. First, they're made up of 3 statements, right? 2 premises and a conclusion. Right, and all of those statements are standard form categorical propositions, right? So that means that they have a quantifier, a subject term, a copula, and a predicate term. Second, as we'll see in these arguments, right, each term, predicate term and subject term in the various propositions occurs twice, right? And we want those to be identical, right? We'll talk more about this in a moment. Each term, right, the subject term or the predicate term, right, is used in the same sense throughout the argument. And then the major premise is listed first, the minor premise second, and the conclusion last. Okay, so major premise, minor premise, what are those? Well, let's come back to it in a second here. I'm going to go through these one by one and say a little bit more about them. So first feature of syllogisms, right? All 3 statements are standard form categorical propositions. This just means that each statement has a quantifier out front, followed by a subject term, followed by the copula, are or are not, right? And a predicate term, right? So the quantifier is what? Either blank or blank. That's right, all or some, right? The copula is are or are not. Right, so 3 statements, 2 premises, and the conclusion, right? They're made up of standard form categorical propositions, right? And each standard form categorical proposition has 2 terms, right? The subject term and the predicate term. What the second condition tells us is that the 2 occurrences of each term are identical. So let's look at this argument again. All vertebrates are mammals. All mammals are dogs. Therefore, all dogs are vertebrates. So what's the subject term in our first premise? Vertebrates. What about the predicate term in our first premise? Mammals. Subject term in our second premise, right? Mammals. And predicate term, dogs. And then in our conclusion, the subject term is dogs, and the predicate term is vertebrates. Okay, so you'll note that mammals, the word, right, occurs twice, right? In the first premise once, and then in the second premise once. The term vertebrates occurs twice, right? Once in the first premise as the subject term, and second in the conclusion as the predicate term. And then dogs occurs twice, right? So once as the predicate term in the second premise, and once as the subject term in the conclusion, right? So each of these each term, right, occurs twice, and they're identical, meaning, well, what? Just that they're put in here the same way. So think about this. It becomes pretty clear, I think, with this third condition, right? So each term is used in the same sense throughout the argument, meaning, briefly, no equivocation, right? So think about this argument. All things swung by basketball. Baseball players are bats. All flying mammals are bats. Therefore, all flying mammals are things swung by baseball players, right? So what happens here? Well, it's a weird argument if bats receives the same interpretation throughout. Rather, what happens here is that bat is used in one sense in the first premise and in another sense in the second. Okay, so let's go back to two occurrences of each term are identical. Well, this is one way they might not be identical, right? If they're spelled the same and they're pronounced the same, but they don't mean the same, right? Another way that they might be non-identical is if we said something like, all dogs are mammals, and then later, instead of dogs, we had like all things that are dogs, right? So you might think, look, they mean the same thing, but yeah, fine, but the two occurrences of the term aren't identical, right? So we should use either dogs or things that are dogs throughout uniformly. All right, and now we have this. The major premise is listed first, the minor premise second, and the conclusion last. Okay, so to make sense of what this is, we have to introduce some terminology. So major premise, major term, minor term, and we'll throw in there middle term just for good measure. Okay, so what's the major premise? Well, here's one thing we could say. It contains the major term. Okay, fine. Minor premise, it contains the minor term. But now, what, we've just kicked the can down the road, right? We want to know what major term and minor term are. Well, here's a way that we can do it that's non-circular, right, or doesn't kick the can down the road, as it were. The major term, right, it's the predicate of the conclusion, the predicate term of the conclusion, and the minor term is the subject or subject term of the conclusion, right? And then the middle term occurs in both major and minor premises. So let's look at a particular argument to distinguish these from one another. Okay, so we have our argument down here. All vertebrates are mammals. All mammals are dogs. Therefore, all dogs are vertebrates. Let's find the major premise. So we know that this contains the major term, right? And what's the major term? Well, it's the predicate of the conclusion. Okay, so what's the predicate of our conclusion? Therefore, all dogs are vertebrates. Well, it's vertebrates, right? So where's the major premise? Right, there's our major term. Which of the premises contains that term? Well, the first one, right? So the first one is our major premise. What about the minor premise? Well, this contains the minor term. And what's the minor term? Well, it's the subject of the conclusion, right? So in this argument, what term is the minor term? Dogs, right? It's the subject of the conclusion. And here we go. Here's the minor premise highlighted in yellow. All mammals are dogs, right? So far, so good. So let's think back to our condition here, right? This fourth condition. We needed the major premise listed first, then the minor premise, and then the conclusion. Right, so do we have the major premise listed first? Yes, right, all vertebrates are mammals, right? That is the major premise because it contains the major term, right, where the major term is the predicate of the conclusion, in this case, vertebrates. And then we have the minor premise, right? All mammals are dogs. How do we know that's the minor premise? Well, it contains the minor term, right, which is the subject of the conclusion, dogs. Okay, now we have this thing at the end here, the middle term. So what's that? Well, it occurs in both the major and minor premise, right, or the premises, rather. So which term occurs in both? Mammals, right? Ignore the underlined dogs there. I'm not sure why that's there. But mammals occurs in both, right? It occurs in both the major and minor premise. So let's sort of take a step back and think about what's going on with these sorts of arguments, these syllogisms. Right? We have our major premise, our minor premise, and our conclusion. Right? The major premise contains the major term, right, which is, that's right, the predicate of the conclusion. The second premise contains the minor term, right, which is, that's right, the subject of the conclusion. And then there's this middle term, right, that goes both in the first premise, that is the major premise, and also in the second premise, that is the minor premise. Okay, so what's going on here, right, is that there's some sort of relation that's being sort of asserted, right, between the first and second premise and these terms, right, and what these terms denote, right, which are classes or sets or groups, right? So the first one says, consider all the things that are vertebrates, right? They're mammals. And the second one says, well, consider all the mammals, they're dogs, right? So then the premises together say, well, consider all the things that are vertebrates, all of those things are mammals, and all of those things, that is the mammals, are dogs, right? So what this middle term is doing, right, is bridging the gap, right? It's somehow tying these things together, right? So never mind in this particular example whether or not the premises are true or false, it doesn't matter, right? That's what the middle term is doing, right? And how it relates to the major premise, the minor premise, the major term, and the minor term. Okay, so that's what a categorical syllogism is, or we'll probably just say a syllogism, right? Because categorical is quite a mouthful. Okay, so sort of think about, again, what it is that we're doing here. We're trying to figure out when syllogisms are valid or invalid. So what's going to be helpful here, right, is if we can talk about all syllogisms that have something in common. So what we're going to do is introduce two notions. The first one is mood, and the second one is figure, right? And we're going to assign to each syllogism a mood and a figure, right? And once we've done that, we can make generalizations about categorical syllogisms, right? And about whether or not they're valid or invalid, right? So let's see how that's going to work. So remember that categorical propositions come in four forms, right? So what are they? So we have A, E, I, and O. A1s, right, are of the form all S or P. E are of the form no S or P. I are of the form some S or P. And O are of the form some S or not P. Okay. So we can use that information, right, to determine the mood of categorical syllogisms, right? So what we're going to be doing here, right, is just assigning a letter to each premise and then the conclusion in that order, right? So let's start with this one. So what is the mood of this categorical syllogism? So let's see how to figure that out, and then we'll say what the mood is. So our first premise, the major premise, right, because it contains the predicate of the conclusion, that is the major term, right, is of the form A. All M are P, that's of the form all S are P. Our second one, all S are M, right, our minor premise, right, because it contains the minor term, which is the subject of the conclusion, also of type A. All S are M, that's of the form all S are P. And then finally our conclusion, all S are P, right, again, of type A, right, because it's of the form all S or P. All right, so we've listed these three letters, A, in order, right? So the first one corresponds to the first premise, the second one to the second, and the third one to the conclusion, right? So the mood of any argument, any syllogism of this form, all S or all M are P, all S are M, all S are P, is A. Let's do one without variables, right? So all dogs are things that are fluffy. Some things that are fluffy are things that are small. Some things that are small are dogs. Okay, so let's check first to make sure this is in standard form for a categorical syllogism. Okay, so first premise is the major premise, right? Because it contains the predicate of the conclusion, the predicate of the conclusion. Second premise, right, is the minor premise, right, because it contains the subject of the conclusion, things that are small. Okay. Looks like each term is used in the same way throughout, right, and each one is identical throughout. Yeah, good. So two premises, conclusion. So this should be a categorical syllogism. Right. hint, I made it a categorical syllogism, so okay. But anyway, you should be able to test to see whether or not you have a categorical syllogism or not. Okay, so let's figure out the mood of this one. Right, so again, what we're going to do is assign a sentence letter, right, to the first premise, and then to the second, and then to the conclusion. So why don't you give this one a try on your own? Right, so you can pause me or just wait for a second. So here's what you should have come up with. For our first premise, sentence type A, all dogs are things that are fluffy. That's of type A, all S are P. Second one, type I, some things that are fluffy are things that are small, right? Some S are P. And then our conclusion, some things that are small are dogs, also of type I. So the mood for this categorical syllogism is A, I. Okay, so what you're going to be doing for all of these, right? Once you have it in standard form, right, you're just going to assign the sentence letter for the first premise, second premise, conclusion. Put them in order. That's the mood. So again, here's what you do. Just list in order the letter type of the major and minor premises, then the conclusion. That's the mood of the categorical syllogism. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about mood for now, right? I trust that this is straightforward enough that you've got it. If you don't, please, please, please let me know. Okay, so in addition to having a mood, right, each categorical syllogism also has a figure. So there are 4 figures. So what's going on here, right, is that the M stands for the middle term, the P stands for the predicate, and the S stands for the subject term. Well, the predicate and subject term of what? Well, of the conclusion. So what's being depicted here, right, is the order of the middle term and the major term, right, in the first line, relative to one another. So in figure 1, right, in our first line, M, P, this means that the major term, the middle term, M, right, comes before the major term, P, the predicate of the conclusion. In figure 2, right, what's being depicted is that the predicate term of the conclusion, that is the major term, comes before the middle term. Right? What's happening in figure 3? Try to explain it, maybe aloud or to yourself. Well, what it's showing is that the middle term, M, right, comes before the predicate term of the conclusion, that is the major term. Right? And then finally in figure 4, it's showing that the predicate of the conclusion, that is the major term, comes before the middle term. Okay, so the first line represents the order of the major term and the middle term relative to one another in a categorical syllogism. So what we could imagine, right, for figure 1, for instance, is that there's a quantifier, our middle term, copula, major term, the predicate of the conclusion. And we've just taken everything out except the middle term and the major term. Same idea for the second line. So in figure 1, right, S, M, this shows that the subject term of the conclusion, that is the minor premise, comes before the middle term. Sorry, the subject term of the conclusion, the minor term, not minor premise, I think I said. Minor term comes before the middle term. Right, in figure 2, right, again, the minor term, that is the subject of the conclusion, comes before the middle term. In figure 3, the middle term, M, comes before the minor term, that is the subject of the conclusion, S, right? And in figure 4, the minor term, or middle term rather, M, comes before the minor term, that is the subject of the conclusion, S. Okay. And then our final line, SP, 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 right? This just shows that the subject of the conclusion comes before the predicate of the conclusion. So let's see how this works in practice. So each categorical syllogism has a mood and a figure. Right, so we already know how to figure out the mood of a categorical syllogism. Let's try to figure out how the figure is determined. So here's our argument again. All dogs are things that are fluffy. Some things that are fluffy are things that are small. Some things that are small are dogs. Okay. So what we want to do is figure out the figure here. So we want to figure out where the subject and predicate of the conclusion are relative to the middle term. So let's start by figuring out where the middle term is, right, in our first and second premises. So what's the middle term? Well, it occurs in both, right? So which term occurs in both the subject, or sorry, in the first premise and in the second? Right? Things that are fluffy. Okay, so note how things that are fluffy is sort of on this diagonal, right? In the first sort of slot in our first premise, right, we have P, that is the predicate of our conclusion, that is the major term, right? In our second premise, we have M and then S, right, the middle term, and then the subject of the conclusion, that is the minor term, right? And then in our conclusion, we have SP. Okay, so the mood here is AII, as before, right? And the figure is 4, right? So the mood and figure of this categorical syllogism is AII 4. All right, do you see how we got that? Right, so sort of what we've done is abstracted away, right, the quantifier and the copula, right? And we've just sort of matched the sort of left behind structure to these figures. So, hint, it's very important that you don't put these figures out of order. Right, so we have figure 1, figure 2, figure 3, figure 4. They have to go in this order, like with these M's and P's and S's, where they are relative to one another. Otherwise, you're just going to mess this up. Okay, so we'll do another one, but let's sort of like take a step back and think about what we're doing so far, right? So we have our categorical syllogisms. We found out how to figure out their mood, right? We're working on figuring out their figure, right? But what's the point of this? Well, again, what we want to do is figure out whether or not these arguments are valid or invalid, right? And the way to do this, right, is to make generalizations about the structure of these arguments. Remember, these arguments are valid or invalid in virtue of their structure, right? So what's the relevant structure here? Well, let's think back to arguments in sentential logic, right, where we were a few weeks ago, right, where we had our logical operators like if, then, and, or, not. Right, those arguments we found out were valid in virtue of the structure, right, where the structure had to do with the truth functional operators, if, then, and so on. Right, here we don't have truth functions. We have quantifiers and copulas and subject terms and predicate terms. Right, and the subject terms and the predicate terms are related to one another through the copula and the quantifier. Right, so what this sort of logic, the syllogistic logic, is capturing, right, or trying to capture, is the sort of form of these arguments having to do with where the quantifiers and copulae are relative to the predicate terms and subject terms and the middle terms. Right, so that's sort of what we're trying to do. Right, and what we need to know more than just the mood, right? The mood just tells us what sort of statement type we have and in what order, right? So first premise, second premise, conclusion, right? We're missing out on some structure, right? And that missing structure is what's supplied by figure, right? Where the middle term is relative to the predicate term of the conclusion, subject term of the conclusion, and so on. Right, so once we have mood and figure, right, we can make all sorts of generalizations, but we need more than just mood. We need more than just figure. We have to like shove them together. So let's try to figure out, for this argument, what its mood and figure are. So pause me, try to do this on your own. All right, so here's our argument. All stars are people who are famous. Some people who are famous are not people who are friendly. Therefore, some people who are friendly are not stars. Okay, so what is the sentence type or statement type for our first premise? It's A, right? What about for our second premise? It's O. Some S are not P, right? O. And then some S are not P again, right? O. So the mood is A, O, O. Our figure is, well, it turns out it's 4 again, right? So why is that? Well, look where our middle term is. People who are famous, right? This occurs in both the first premise and the second premise, so it's our middle term, right? It's in second position in the first line and in first position in the second, right? Which corresponds to figure 4. Right, so the mood and figure of this syllogism is A004. Okay, so who cares, right? Again, sort of what are we trying to do here? Right, so this information actually tells us whether the argument is valid. Right, so if we know this information, we're in a position to tell whether or not the argument's valid. Well, it turns out sort of. Right? The important point is that unconditionally valid arguments with the same mood and figure are all valid. Right? And unconditionally invalid arguments with the same mood and figure are all invalid. Right? So what does that mean? Well, this stuff is explained in the book. We'll come back to it in a moment in the next lecture, but here's the idea. So there are these, what are these? Charts? I guess these are charts. These are charts in your book. Okay. So let's look at the bottom one, unconditionally valid forms. So let's look at our first one, A of figure 1. Right, what this chart tells us is that any categorical syllogism of the mood and figure A1 is valid. Right, just valid, all of them. Right, and any one of E1 is valid. Right, so if you memorized these, right, which would be a huge waste of time, don't do it. If you memorized these, right, and you knew the mood and figure, right, you could tell whether or not the argument was valid or invalid. So what gets tricky here, right, is that we have these forms that are what we'll call conditionally valid, right, and their validity is conditional on some conditions being met, right, so figure 1, AAA1, or AAI1 rather, right? Simply knowing that an argument is of that form doesn't tell us whether it's valid or invalid. Sort of oddly, for our purposes, given how we've sort of been thinking about validity, we have to know something about the world, right? Are there any S's in this case? So this is the required condition. So in the next few lectures, we'll return to that. But for now, right, so what we've been doing, figuring out the mood and figure, right, we can use this to make generalizations about other arguments, right? Maybe arguments that we haven't seen yet, right? So if I know that some argument of form AAA1, or sorry, mood and figure AAA1 is valid, then I know that all argument forms with that mood and figure are valid.